Well, thank you so much. I am so happy to be here with you tonight, and I am really thankful that the Illinois Prairie chapter of Wild Ones has invited me to give this presentation. I will be talking about designing with native plants and provide some tips for species selection, design concepts, and some maintenance practices. So before I get into my talk, I do want to recognize the organizations that I am representing tonight. If I can get my slides to advance. There we go. I am with the Missouri Department of Conservation. We are the state government agency that is constitutionally mandated to conserve and protect fish, forest, and wildlife resources in the state of Missouri. But part of my job duties with MDC is I am a liaison with Grow Native, and that is a program of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. You can see from the map on this slide where their area is. They serve the lower Midwest, so the kind of outside the borders of Missouri a little bit. And I gave a very similar talk as a Grow Native webinar back in January of 2021. So if you would like to revisit that talk, which will be very similar to tonight, but also see other recorded webinars hosted on the Missouri Prairie Foundation's YouTube channel. The URL is here on this slide, or you can just Google Missouri Prairie Foundation YouTube channel and find it that way. But they have quite a few webinars from the last couple of years that you can view for free on their channel. And so you may find some that really interest you. But thank you again for having me as your guest speaker tonight. And let's get into the presentation. There are quite a few criteria that I consider when selecting plants for any kind of plan that I'm working on. They're listed on this slide in no particular order, but they do include a consideration of how the space will be used or how it will be programmed. And this is not only for how people will use the space, but also potentially how wildlife are going to use the designed space. I'm also going to consider any green infrastructure needs, including ecosystem benefit services that I might want to have provided within the context of my project. I'm going to spend some time thinking about a theme or design concept, and this is where I'm going to rely on art elements and principles of design to help me convey that theme to people who use or view this space. Of course, you have to analyze your site conditions, so your amount of sunlight, your soil types, wind conditions on your site, and amount of rainfall it's going to get over the course of the year. Those are all very important to consider. And then also plant availability. You don't want to set yourself up feeling like you're really in love with a particular plant species, only to find at the very end that it's not available either at all in the commercial retail trade, or that the nursery you're working with just won't have it for when you're ready to start planting. So it's a good idea to have some substitutes in mind, or some alternative species that meet all the other criteria of your plan, just in case some of your plants are not available to purchase. And once you've considered those 5 criteria, pretty much your plant list will be finalized, and it's almost more of a case that your plants reveal themselves to you rather than you selecting plants for your project. It's really interesting the way it all comes together. Before I leave this slide, I do want to point out the photograph I've got on my screen. This was taken at a natural area in the Ozarks. That's the ecoregion that covers southern Missouri. And this photograph was taken on a glade in southern Missouri. And I want to use it to just encourage you, if you're just now learning about native plants, to get outside and visit some natural areas. You will learn so much about how these plants grow in nature, and also some of the companion species that they're associated with, because those are going to be ones that you might consider using as you develop your planting plans, are plants that commonly grow together in natural areas. So this photograph here, while it was taken at a natural area, the photo on my next slide was taken from a designed landscape. This photo comes to us from the Lorry Garden at Millennium Park in Chicago, Illinois. And every plant you see here, even though the appearance of this planting is similar to the natural area, every plant here was specified on a planting plan. They were located on a layout plan to go in very specific locations. So it's a similar appearance, but it's an example of a designed landscape versus a naturally occurring landscape. So this is a slide where I want to visit a little bit more with you about site programming and how it can inform your plant selection. When thinking about how the site will be used, it's important to consider if this is a public space you're working in or a private space. So is it a public, say a government plaza, for example, or is it very private, like somebody's backyard? Then there's also quasi-public spaces. I think many people's front yards fall into that category. And as I mentioned before, take some time to consider if wildlife will be using this area that you are planting, or is it just going to primarily be for people? You can consider if the site will be used for large gatherings or for active use or just passive use for passive recreation or meditation. If there will be work zones. So this might be something like a produce garden in a backyard or a compost area, or even something more involved like some green infrastructure for a community. And let's take a minute now to consider the definition of green infrastructure, because it's very common to see definitions that focus very tightly into green infrastructure as something for stormwater management purposes, which it can be, but I like a much broader definition of green infrastructure. The one on this slide is the one that I find makes the most sense to me. And it's that green infrastructure consists of strategically planned and managed networks of natural lands, engineered systems, working landscapes, and other open spaces that can serve ecosystem values and functions and provide associated benefits to human populations. So taking a step back and just thinking about infrastructure as a whole, these are working systems that are providing they're doing a job, they're providing a benefit to people. A gray infrastructure system is one that is going to be man-made or constructed. These are things like your sewer networks underground, or your transportation system, all of your roads, or even your utility network. Those are examples of gray infrastructure. Green infrastructure, on the other hand, relies on plants to do the work. And they can either be natural lands or engineered lands, or lands that were purposefully planted to perform very specific jobs. Now, that definition included ecosystem values. So let's move on now to ecosystem services and what that means. Those are the benefits of nature to people, households, communities, and economies. Ecosystem services can be broken down into 4 large categories. Those include provisioning services. So this is when nature provides us with food, fiber, and fresh water. Regulating services, those happen when nature does such services as flood control, disease control, or climate regulation. Supporting services happen when nature helps with soil formation, soil retention, crop pollination, and even nutrient cycling. And then very interestingly, we have what's known as cultural services. And these are the non-material benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, either through spiritual enrichment or cognitive development, reflection, recreation, and then even encompassing all of our aesthetic benefits. So even though I said I like a definition of green infrastructure that's broader than stormwater management, I'm going to start with this service first, because it is so ubiquitous now in landscape design, is using your landscaped areas to somehow help you manage your stormwater runoff. This particular planting is located in front of a building in Columbia, Missouri. And you can see from the downspouts on the building and the culvert that is peeking out on the very far right side of that photo, that runoff from the building and the grounds is being directed to this bed. It's lined with gravel and it's planted with plants that really perform well in this type of setting of a rainwater practice. The predominant plant you see in this photo is the horsetail rush. Now, you have to be careful with plants like this that are prolific spreaders, because using them where you want them in a particular spot in a bed with a lot of plant diversity may not succeed, because this plant does like to spread. But this particular design here really, it really embraces that nature of this plant by giving it room to spread where it wants to and fill in if it wants to, because it is going to still provide the function intended by this particular landscape bed. Other plants that are very popular for stormwater management projects, these native plants are some of my favorites for this type of green infrastructure. They include buttonbush, copper iris, soft rush, and mist flower. The rainwater management practice shown in that lower right photograph is a rain garden. And if you follow the street gutter up the photograph, you can see a second rain garden in the photograph. There was a series of rain gardens that were constructed along a residential street in Springfield, Missouri. It was a partnership between the city and the homeowners. And the goal of the project was to divert enough runoff off of that street and into these rain gardens that it would reduce the ponding at the intersection at the end of the block. So they were the objectives here were not only public safety, trying to make the streets safer to drive on during rain events, but also water quality by having those rain gardens hold on to the runoff and infiltrate them into front yards. So the city, they did curb cuts to divert runoff from the street and then allow runoff to go back onto the street once it filled each rain garden. And there were probably about 7 rain gardens in total constructed along the street. And so that really did help meet the goal of reducing the amount of flooding at the intersection at the bottom of this block. So that was a really good example of using native plants to perform multiple jobs in one project. I love before and after pictures, and these are really good ones here. If you look at the upper left corner of each photo, you can see the silver roof of that little maintenance hut. So the before photo shows just a very narrow strip of mowed grass in this parking lot, was not providing very much as far as ecosystem services. So it was demolished and it was replaced with what you see in the photo on the right, which was a wide bioswale planted primarily with native plants. But this bioswale is performing the job of filtering pollutants that are running off of the parking lot and helping to slow that water down, cool it down, and overall improve the water quality. Moving on to a different type of ecosystem service, prairie plants are often held in high regard for how well they hold soil into place and prevent erosion, and also providing the supporting service of soil formation. So this graphic here shows a good illustration of how native plant roots, some can grow as deep as 15 feet into the ground, and that really helps hold that soil in place. And then as the plants turn over and go through their dormancy cycles, some of those roots are going to help form new soil then in the future. All right, I want to move on now to how selecting a theme for our garden or our landscape can help select plants. In this section, we'll talk about design concepts. We'll talk about the difference between naturescaping and nativescaping, and we'll have an overview of some art elements that are very handy to keep in mind when working on a design plan. The photo here is of a healing and meditation garden at a hospital. And while it's not completely full of native plants, there are some natives here. What I like about this as an example of a themed garden is you can see how calming this space would be because of the color palette used. They're very cool colors, and the forms of the plants are primarily a very neutral mounded form. So all of these work in conjunction to help establish the theme that this is a healing garden. In Joplin, Missouri, there was a garden that was constructed after a very devastating tornado went through the town back in 2011. This is a memorial park. The structures and sculptures used in the garden help reflect that. The wall on the left side photograph is time-stamped with the time when the tornado touched down at this particular location. In the center photograph on the top of the slide, you can see what looks like a picket fence and the outlines of some houses. Those all go to memorialize all of the homes that were destroyed by the tornado. But you also see that this area is labeled as a butterfly garden and overlook. So you can have one theme nested inside of another theme of a larger space. You don't have to just be restricted to just one theme or one design concept within an overall garden. You can have multiple ones working together. So we've got the ecosystem service of having some wildlife habitat. We've got this butterfly garden. And so some of the plants in that garden are going to be native species that perform that function of providing habitat. So we've got, through the plant selection here and through the other man-made elements, everything working in conjunction to create the theme of this particular garden. Now this slide shows us an example of a garden theme that is also reflected in the name of the garden. This is the Garvin Woodland Gardens in Northwest Arkansas. In the photograph on the left, if you were to place yourself on that rock pathway and walk towards the building in the background, which you may not have even noticed at first, that is a chapel designed by architect Fay Jones, who is renowned for this type of design. He has chapels in several other public gardens and spaces across the South. But the architectural design, the materials of that building, the plants selected in this space, those tall trees, they all work together to create this theme of a woodland garden. And if you're on that pathway and you approach the building, you will come across as you see in the photo on the right, this large plant bed that's completely full of these woodland ferns. So those ferns, they work perfectly in unison with the rest of the design to really enhance the woodland feel of this space. You can imagine if there was a different plant in that bed instead of those big, beautiful ferns, that it might not work as well. If instead of those ferns, let's pretend instead that bed was filled with knockout roses, it would completely change the feeling. The appearance would be completely different. The way you would feel in the space would be different. It would seem the roses would seem out of place in this garden. So that's one indication. If everything seems like it belongs there, but you are working within your theme and you are enhancing your concept through your plant selection. We'll move on now to a discussion of naturescaping versus nativescaping. This slide is, I think, a good one for this topic. When I very first started off with giving these types of talks, I would often get a question from an audience member as to, if I was designing with native plants, how I would handle the criticism of having such a wild looking landscape, such a wild looking garden. And I was usually rather Not exactly sure what was meant by that question, but I finally realized it was because people were using the word wild as a synonym for natural. So they thought that if you were using native plants in your designed garden, that what you would end up with would be similar to the photograph on this slide, something that looked very naturalized. But that's not the case. The landscape in front of this house looks the way it does because that's how it was intended to look. They've done a naturescape that is trying to capture the appearance of a native prairie. You can have naturescapes that try to resemble other types of natural terrestrial communities, such as a glade or a woodland or a forest. But if you are intentionally creating a very natural look, then you are doing something called naturescaping. And that is perfectly acceptable if that is what you intend to do. That is not what everybody who designs with native plants intends, though. Some of them want to have a look that is not naturalized at all, but they still want to use all native plant species. And if that's the case, then that they are doing something that I call nativescaping. They are landscaping with native plants. The two photos here on this slide are good examples of nativescaping. These are both in commercial spaces. The photo on the left of your slide shows an entryway landscape bed in front of an office in St. Louis, Missouri. There's a ground cover of groundsel, or otherwise known as golden ragwort, or squawweed is another common name for that plant. And in the background of that bed, you see some wild hydrangea and a redbud tree. The photo on the right shows a monoculture of switchgrass in a raised bed. This particular example shows not a true, pure native of that species, but a cultivar of that species. And we know that because of the foliage color. The true native of switchgrass has a very vibrant green color. This particular example has more of a maroon color in its foliage. So that to me tells me that it is a cultivar, which is a genetic modification of the true native species. Some people draw a line in the sand and say you should never use a cultivar. But for me, it all depends on what the objectives of your project are. If I were wanting to provide wildlife habitat, I would absolutely use the true pure native. And that is because those species co-evolved with the pollinators and the insects and the other wildlife that might use that plant as habitat. Studies show that a true native species provides better nutrition and more effective habitat for native wildlife than cultivars do. However, if wildlife habitat is not one of the objectives of my project, which in this example, I highly doubt that that was an objective of this particular landscape project, then a cultivar may be an acceptable option. I imagine that for this particular project that the designer was interested in having a plant in that raised bed of sufficient size that it would completely fill out the bed, that it would grow tall enough to create a visual screen between the patio and the parking lot, and that the color might be a complementary color to that olive green of the umbrella there on the patio. So those considerations may have been the only thing that were listed out as project objectives, and in which case a cultivar of a native plant species is perfectly acceptable to use. This section on art elements, I'm going to be giving some definitions, and it may start to sound rather academic. So I'm going to try to balance that with showing some photographs of native plants used in design spaces that show us real life examples of those art elements. So bear with me as I throw some definitions at you. I really like this slide because it pairs up some paintings with some photographs that show the same type of art element. So you really get the idea that we can view plants just broken down into their various artistic elements and view them that way, which may be a way of looking at plants that you've never looked at before. But we'll start with color, and I will touch on color in the next slide as well. But just to begin with, color refers to wavelengths of light. Now, that's very academic, I know, but let's get into this a little bit more. The painting here shows these oranges and yellows, and then it's paired with the photograph of some dogwood shrubs that exhibit the same colors in their stems. So we've got the oranges and the yellows in the stems. Now we can move over to the right side of the slide and look at how shapes can be exhibited in the painting at the top. We've got the points shown by those large white points. We can see lines. Looks like the paint kind of dripped down the canvas to form lines. When we think of those shapes, we're thinking in terms of 2 dimensions. If we want to bring those shapes into the 3rd dimensions, they're going to become forms. So the photograph at the bottom of your screen shows how the points have become spheres in those spherical shaped flower heads. And then we've got the lines that now are in the 3rd dimension with the plant stems. Looking over to, and before I move on to value, I will say you can consider each individual part of a plant as its own form, but you can also consider the entire plant as a form. And then you can also consider how the plant, if it's massed together with other plants of the same species, how a mass of those plants might have a completely different form than each individual plant or each part of the plant does. So you can really dig down into form several layers deep during your design process. Moving on to value. Value is the lightness or the darkness. So in this case, the white has a very high value and the black of the painting and the photograph has a very low value. Value also refers to how much of a reflection there might be. So if you think of a highly glossy plant leaf, that's going to have a high value, whereas a very dull leaf might have a low value. The photograph here on the right side of your screen shows 2 different elements in this landscape bed that have a very similar value. It's a very high value in color. You've got the white of the limestone rock that is directly in front of some little blue stem, a native warm season grass. But it has such a light colored foliage that it is a very similar value to that rock placed in front of it. So I think the designer here did a very good job of matching up 2 different elements within that one bed that both have the same value. Okay, back to color. I'm not going to get too deep into color theory, but I did want to point out 2 strategies that you can work with color that are very visually pleasing. So we have the color wheel here, but if you consider colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel, those are known as analogous colors. These look very pleasing to each other, pleasing to the eye. So the photograph on the top left of your screen shows rose verbena planted next to royal catchfly. The colors of their blooms are adjacent to each other on the color wheel with the reds to the violets. So they look really good placed next to each other. Colors opposite each other on the color wheel are complementary colors. And the yellow is complementary to the violet, and you can see this in the photograph on the right. We've got the yellow bloom of the gray-headed coneflower next to the purple bloom of the wild bergamot. And they do look really nice next to each other. You can also use color to unify your landscape. Here we've got in the photo on the left, this was taken at City Garden in St. Louis. The bright red of the sculpture it's completely, it shows up again, the same red color in the background with the bloom of the cardinal flower. The photo on the right side is another, a different angle of that same bed. We've got cardinal flower planted in a row behind some soft rush. And just that use of repeating the same color in the landscape is helping to unify this entire garden. Proportion is the next element I'm going to touch on. Proportion is the relationship of sizes between different parts of a work. We're going to go back and revisit Lori Garden in Chicago for a quick minute. Here on the conceptual design sketch you see on the left of your screen, we've got an arching purple line bisecting a field of green. The photograph on the right is how that plan was executed. And you'll notice that purple line, it stands out very clearly. It's very bold. It makes a very strong statement. If that purple line were twice as wide, it would wash out. It wouldn't be as noticeable in a field of green as it is. So I think I really like this example for proportion because it shows you the impact that the size of your elements in your garden can make when they're viewed as a whole. This slide is all about visual weight and how balanced or how heavy it is. On the left, we're going to see a photo that shows us the element of balance. A feeling of balance results when the elements of a design are arranged either symmetrically or asymmetrically to create the impression of equality, or where you have weight of equal importance in your bed. So symmetrical balance is you basically have a mirror image in your bed of plants that create that feeling of balance, that feeling of visual equality. This photograph, though, is an example of asymmetrical balance. So we have one tall element, one tall tree on the right side of the bed, but visually it is balanced by the mass of yellow flowers that fill in the rest of that bed. On the right side of your screen, you'll see we're going to have a discussion of dominance and subordination because the two work together. In terms of landscape design, the strongest focal point with the greatest visual weight is the dominant element of your work. And elements with lesser visual weight are subordinate to the dominant feature of your design. Now, in order to really achieve a dominant and subordinate relationship, you need one element to be obviously the dominant element. And I think the photograph I'm showing you here shows you what can happen when you don't have an obvious dominant element. Visually, it looks uncomfortable. Here we have a redbud tree that's growing in a bed with a ground cover of shining blue star. The blue star is so big in comparison with that redbud tree that it's almost like it is fighting for dominance, even though it is the ground cover. So to truly achieve these two elements, you either need a much larger tree or you need a much shorter ground cover. Harmony and unity are elements that are very similar to each other. Harmony is the arrangement of elements to give the viewer the feeling that all the parts of the piece form a coherent whole. I like this photo on the left of your screen from the High Line in New York City. I think it does a good job of showing a harmonious landscape that's achieved from the color of the bench being reflected, or it's being copied by the color of the foliage of the plant that is directly behind it. Because you have the same color in different parts of your design, you've achieved a very harmonious look. Unity, on the other hand, is achieved when all parts of the image work together to be seen as a whole. The photo on the right is a residential landscape, and I think all parts of this design work together to achieve unity, from the color palette to the hardscape materials to the native plants selected for the front patio area. Everything is working together to form a very unified design. Rhythm is a very interactive element because it involves the use of using a recurring element to direct your eye through an image. So it's the way that you move somebody's eye through either your photograph or in person, move it through the space that you've designed. So it's almost like you are interacting with the viewer of your landscape design, which is really a neat idea, that as the designer, you are in the future having this interaction with people visiting the space that you have designed. So the example here I have is a photograph taken in Springfield, Missouri, of a row of bald cypress trees. Your eye immediately goes to that very first bald cypress tree, but once it's there, you can't help but follow it down the street, because the recurring element of that very strong vertical line of the trunk of the tree is pulling your eye through that scene. Other elements could be repeated. It doesn't have to be the same form. It could be the same size. It could be the same texture or color, but something that repeats, that really draws you, that draws your eye. Time is really a fascinating element when it comes to landscape design. You're going to consider how the appearance of your plant is going to change over its lifetime. So think about how drastically different a tree seedling looks to a mature tree. But you can also consider how your plant will change in appearance over one growing season. So the example here is two pictures of little blue stem, one taken in the summer, one taken in the fall. You can see some differences and some similarities. The differences include a change in the color and a change in the visual texture of this plant. The similarities include that the plant has remained the same size and it's retained the same form throughout its growing season. Texture can either be tactile texture, or how the plant feels to your fingertips, or it can be visual texture. These two photos taken side by side show a nice contrast of visual texture. The golden sill on the left has a very coarse visual texture. The grasses on the right have a very wispy, fine visual texture. Although you can also imagine, if you were to touch both those plants, that they would both have a very smooth texture and not something that would be sticky, or something where thorns might poke at you and be a very uncomfortable tactile texture. And the last element I will share tonight is that of variety. Variety involves the use of different art elements to create visual interest. The photo here comes from Compton Gardens in Bentonville, Arkansas. The grasses on the left side of this walkway, they both have the same color, but there are elements between them that are different and that really do create a sense of variety. The sizes of these two grasses are different. The forms of the grasses are different. One is upright, the other has a fountain form. The visual texture is a little bit different, although I will say the taller grass, it has both a spiky texture at the top with those seed heads, but also, fountain grass, and if you were to touch the seed head, that it would be a very soft, tactile texture. So I really like the use of these grasses next to each other to create that sense of variety in the bed, even though really it's a bed full of just grass. Okay, so I walked you through those five criteria for helping select plants pretty quickly. I'm going to give you a real life case study now so you can see how I put all of those together when working on a design. This case study comes to us from the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum in Mansfield, Missouri. I was asked to design the front plant, the landscape beds on the front of the museum between the parking lot and the museum entrance. So one of the criteria we talked about was, how is the space going to be used? How will it be programmed? Well, this is it's a museum that's open to the public. It receives about 30,000 visitors per year. And so I knew that the space would be basically just a walkthrough for visitors. They wouldn't be really, sitting in the space or spending time there, but it would be a very dominant feature in front of this museum. The theme was already selected. I was asked to create a design that would remind visitors of the Little House on the Prairie books that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote and make them think of a prairie landscape. So I knew I would be doing naturescaping and trying to create something that looks like a prairie. I was also able to visit the site and analyze all the site conditions. And I was able to consider the ecosystem services that we would ask this landscape to provide. So first and foremost, there was an interest in these beds providing monarch butterfly habitat. So that in itself would help inform my plant selection. And also, once I got to the site, this is what I encountered. I realized that the bed was actually rather steep. There was a rather steep incline between the parking lot and the front doors of the building. So another ecosystem service that was needed in this design was plants that would help hold the soil in place, which luckily the prairie species that I was going to use to go with the design concept or the theme of this garden also are known for being very effective at holding soil in place. And luckily also could be specific plants could go into those two considerations that would provide the monarch habitat. So in this table reflects how I started charting out the species that I was considering using. This was my final table, but my working drafts I did have several different species over time that I considered. But for the habitat aspect, I knew I needed to provide some milkweed that the monarchs could lay eggs on and that would provide food for the monarch caterpillars. But I would also need some nectar producing wildflowers that could give energy to the adult butterflies as they came through this location. So my flower list, I knew I needed some nectar flowers and some milkweed flowers. And because of the site program, how it would be used, I knew that this site would be visited, the museum would be visited throughout the year, but predominantly during the summer months. So I needed to map out when my plants would be blooming. And if you look at the row on the bottom of this table, you can see that the species that were selected, that more species bloom during June and July than any other month throughout the year. So that was another intentional design plant selection choice based on the criteria of the project. Now, considering plant availability, that was another criteria. I looked at several nurseries that had the plants that were going to be in stock for when I needed them. So the table on the left, the far left column shows the amount of plants I needed. And the next column shows how many plants were in stock at this particular nursery that would be available for when I needed them for planting. You might notice that butterfly weed is indicated here in red, that's because this particular nursery was not able to provide enough small pots when I needed them, but they would be able to provide this particular plant in quart-size pots. And that's important to know because that the size of the plant that you order when you order container grown plants is going to impact your budget for your project. The larger the container size, the more expensive the plants. So I needed to make note of that. Not only was this plant, was I able to know if it was available, but it was important to know at what size and therefore what price it was available. The charts on the right side of the slide show where I was looking at the availability of grasses. And remember when I said sometimes you need to think of alternative species or substitutes in case one species is not available. That happened here. I had two different grasses I was considering to use as an edge species adjacent to the sidewalks. I didn't have a preference, but because of the availability at the nursery, that determined which of those two species I was going to use in this project. I needed 401 grasses. Side oats grama, they only had 400. So even though that was one off, they did have plenty of prairie drop seed. So I just made life easy for myself and specified the drop seed instead of the side oats grama. I did end up making some laminated identification cards for the museum staff of all the plants used in the beds outside. So if a visitor came in and it was May and they said, wow, what is that beautiful flower outside that is has a yellow bloom? The staff would be able to look at their little cheat sheet, show the visitor and say, did it look like this picture? Okay, well then that was a heart-leafed Alexander. So here were all the flowers and here were the grasses used in that project. Now, when it came time to figure out how many plants to order for this project, I needed to know two things. I needed to know the area of my beds and the spacing of my plants. Because I was of knowing that these plants were going to need to quickly appear to be a prairie landscape, and they were going to be asked to hold the soil in place, I wanted a tight spacing. So I decided on 18 inches for all of the plants in the bed. And I was able to measure out and find out the square footage of all of the landscape beds in front of the museum. Now, to determine how many plants I would need to order, I really like using online landscape calculators. There are very many to choose from, but this is one I have bookmarked. It's landscapecalculator.com. So it's easy to remember too. But on the left side of the screen there, you can see they provide two free calculators on this website. One is to figure out how much mulch you'll need for your bed, and the other is to figure out how many plants you need to order. This says annual calculator, but it works for perennials too. So you plug in your square footage of your bed, you plug in your spacing, in this case it was 18 inches, and then that top graphic on the slide shows you that at a triangular spacing, I would need to order 800 plants to fill my beds. This is important because if you use, say, a square spacing instead of a triangular spacing, or you don't take into account that you need not only a certain amount of spacing between plants, but also around the perimeter of your bed, between your plant and the edge of the bed, you're going to end up accidentally ordering more plants than you need. So all those other squares on this slide show that based on having one of those two elements incorrect in your estimation, you're going to end up with more plants. So you're going to spend money you didn't need to spend, and you're going to have leftover plants once you're done planting your bed. And then you're going to have to figure out what to do with those extra plants. So I knew for this particular, to achieve the look I was going for, that naturescape of a prairie, I was going to fill these beds with 70% of my plants were going to be flowers and 30% were going to be grasses. So then it's just a matter of doing the math, and that would tell you exactly how many plants to order for this project. here we are on planting day. We planted very early in the season. We planted in mid-April, but we went in with our small container grown plants. This photo was from April of 2016. The next photograph will be from late in the year of 2017. So a full year will go by. October of 2017, here we are with our container grown plants pretty much have reached their full mature size just in that 1 year after being planted. And I love the fall appearance of this prairie garden. It's the grasses have such rich, deep color. And I love the visual texture of their seed heads. And then I'll show you one more photo from this project. The following summer, so here we are, summer of 2018. And you can see how the beds really are filling in with all of those native plants. And we did have some milkweed blooming. So our goal of trying to create some monarch butterfly habitat was being met. So that was definitely a feel-good moment, seeing those milkweeds in bloom. We're going to shift now to the last section of my talk. This is some maintenance tips. I like saying that the best sort of maintenance tip that you can keep in mind happens during the design phase of your project. So here you can see we have some conflict between the user of this project and the plants. That shrub and the truck are crowding into each other. So the solution during the design phase of this project would have been to either locate that shrub on your layout plan a little bit farther away from the curb of the parking lot, or perhaps to have specified a shorter growing species. Like in this example here, we've got a lead plant, which is a very low growing shrub used in the same situation right next to the curb of a parking lot. So that's the easiest kind of maintenance to do, is the kind that you do during the design phase of your project. In thinking about dormant season maintenance needs, this is the two photographs of the same infiltration bed located in a parking lot in Springfield, Missouri. On the left, it's during the fall. We can see the seed heads of the prairie drop seed and the beautiful fall color of the Virginia sweet spire shrub next to it. Then in the background, there's a black gum, which will also have some beautiful fall color a little bit later in the season. The photograph on the right shows that those grasses have been cut back to the ground, which is a perfectly acceptable way of managing your herbaceous plant material during the winter time. That is fine. An option, if you are concerned about providing some wildlife habitat, you can leave your grasses and your wildflowers or your forbs standing over winter and then cut them back in late winter or early spring. The photo on the left here was taken in May. So it's a little late in the season to be cutting back that dormant vegetation, but it's a good idea to cut it back to give room for the new growth in the summertime. So as the new growth of the grass comes in, it's going to have to grow up through that dormant vegetation that was left standing. The caveat here, though, is if you are interested in providing some wildlife habitat, you might not want to cut back all of the herbaceous vegetation to the same height. You could alternate and cut back some stems shorter than others, anywhere from 8 inches to 24 inches, leaving patches of taller stems, or alternating throughout your entire bed in a pattern. This would specifically be done if you were to take into consideration some cavity nesting bees. Some of those bee species like to nest inside the stems of herbaceous plants, inside the stems of flowers and grasses. So by not cutting back all of them, you leave some standing dormant stems for the bees that are nesting inside of them, but you're cutting back enough that you're giving room for new growth. So It just depends on what the goal of your planting is, whether you cut back everything over winter or some things or nothing. The photo on the right shows, this is the same time of year. This is about probably in May. This is an infiltration planting in a public parking lot. So all the parking lot runoff, when it rains, drains into this planted area. It primarily has a ground cover of lance leaf coreopsis, although at initial planting, there was more of a diversity of ground cover species. But lance leaf coreopsis is a prolific self-seeder. It will spread, just like shown here in this photograph. If this was a smaller planting, after that first flush of blooms, you could get in there and by hand, you could deadhead the spent blooms to make room for multiple bloomings of this one flower, lance leaf coreopsis. It will bloom multiple times in the spring and summer, especially if you keep it deadheaded. But in a large planting like this, especially a municipal landscape, like a public parking lot, you could have your maintenance plan say that after the first flush of blooms that you could go in with like a weed eater and cut everything back to about 12 inches. And that would give space for the next round of blooming to happen. And then you could even repeat that multiple times, go in, cut things back to a standard height and allow that plant to keep blooming. This is a case study that I worked on in Springfield, Missouri. Went in and put a rain garden where there was water just ponding, as you can see in that photograph on the left. On the right, that was after we did the rain garden. I do really like that front border of palm sedge. I think that looks very attractive. Our maintenance issue here, though, was between two plants, one that we put in there on purpose and one that just showed up on its own. The photo on the left shows the goldenrod that we planted, wanting to completely take over this garden. The photo on the right shows a nuisance grass that showed up on its own, didn't belong there, we didn't want it there. So on work day, we went in, removed the front grass, and then cut back the goldenrod to where you can see it growing just in the very center of this bed where it was intended to be according to the design plan. And then the last maintenance example here is cleaning out sediment that might wash into your bed. This particular infiltration bed was designed in conjunction with a sediment forebay. So you can see in the front of the picture there on the left, when this bed was constructed in 2011, it had a sediment forebay, which is just where you trap all of the sediment that is coming into the bed with your stormwater runoff that's draining down off the street. They used a very attractive ornamental rock here as their sediment to capture and hold on to that sediment. But as you can see in the picture on the right, you can only appreciate the ornamental rock if you can still see the ornamental rock. So 3 years after this bed was constructed, the ongoing maintenance was not being performed. The sediment wasn't being removed from the forebay. So the result was that it was draining on into the planted area of the infiltration bed. And after enough time went by, there was so much sediment and other gunk that ended up on top of the plant zone that it's completely smothered out the plants. So here we are in 2018, 7 years after this bed had been constructed, and it's just completely destroyed because of lack of adequate maintenance. But this project has a feel-good ending. In 2018, finally, a maintenance crew showed up. They cleaned out the sediment forebay. We can once again see the beautiful ornamental rock, although it still looks pretty dusty. They removed probably the top several inches from the infiltration bed, replaced it with fresh mulch and new native plants. And I will leave you at the end of my talk with this photo. This is a bed in front of a bank in Jefferson City, Missouri, and it's a wonderful example of a beautiful native fringe tree that is asymmetrically balanced in this bed by the mass of grasses growing as ground cover. So I do appreciate your time. And if there are any questions in the chat, I can help answer those.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. I absolutely love this presentation. You included so much information, and I think one of the things I'm most grateful for is the recommendation on the landscape calculator, which I did add the link in chat if anybody wants that. So we do have, so anybody who has questions, please add them to chat, and I will read them out to Rhonda as you add them to chat. So we do have a question from Carol. Let's see here. I'm losing it here. How do you easily clean rocks in a sediment bed? So I was thinking the same thing. There was quite a bit of sediment there. So what's the best approach to clean that out?
It's going to take some elbow grease, probably a big scoop and a wheelbarrow, and scoop everything up. And you might need to have a couple of wheelbarrows maybe and some fresh water, but you're going to just need to scoop everything up out of that forebay and get it into a container, large buckets or something of that nature, where you can just physically wash off the rock and then return it to the bed. And any sediment that you've washed off the rock, typically what happens is it all gets either left in the buckets or the barrows, and it gets taken someplace where it can be composted.
Thank you. May says, for one, excellent presentation. Thank you. But she's also asking, what do you consider the most dependable native plant during drought conditions?
Oh my gosh, you have so many options for that. My recommendation is you go to any of the websites that have really good native plant finder databases. So I would recommend the Grow Native. If you go to grownative.org, they have an excellent native plant finder database. Also here in Missouri, the Missouri Botanical Garden has an excellent plant finder database on their website. But I would look for species that are associated with glade habitats or prairie habitats. Those are going to be well adapted to drier conditions. Now, some plants in drought conditions may not look like they're thriving, but they're not going to completely die on you. They'll come back the next year when conditions improve. But any species that is associated with a glade habitat is going to excel at drought conditions.
Thank you. And for those of you who are Illinois Prairie chapter members, on our resources page of our website, we do have a list of resources that include a list of native or a plant finder databases, so you can find a variety there. Ryan is wondering, when is it too late in a season to plant a small pot plant, not weed, not marijuana, but a small plant in a small pot? And will a plant survive to the next year if planted after it has already bloomed?
Okay, so I am going to relay to you advice that I received from some of the native plant nurseries that I work with. They are adamant that the happiest native plant is one that is in the ground. So I used to have these complicated formulas of when is the frost season and all these other considerations. And they said, no, as soon as you get it and you can possibly plant a container grown plant, get it in the ground. It's going to be happier there than anywhere else. And so I trust them. I no longer am restricting myself to wait until after mid-April here in southern Missouri, or keeping myself from planting container grown plants after, say, mid-October to early November. If I have it, I'm going to put it in the ground because I do trust their expertise on that. And yes, I would say even if it's already bloomed, I would definitely go ahead and plant it in the ground. I have much more confidence in myself keeping a plant that's in the ground alive than I do keeping a plant that's in a container alive. So I would just plant it and then just try to make sure if it looks like it's struggling, make sure to give it some water. I, again, over time have gotten away from complex formulas of how much water to give plants, to give them so many inches per so many days. It's hard for me to keep all of those formulas in my head. And so I just try to keep an eye on plants. If they look like they need a drink, I give them a drink.
Yeah, I've found that as well too, that it's just easier just to water them if they look wilted a little bit, and usually they bounce back really quickly. Linda says she is seeing a lot of interest in replacing mowed grass with other ground covers. What kinds of design work do you recommend in terms of considering ground cover?
Yes. So one word of warning is there are a lot of native sedge species that can be used to replace turf grass. If planted close enough together, they can fill in an area very well. But you have to be very selective on the particular species of sedge that you use, because they're not all created equal. Some of them will grow very short and have a very compact form, but others will get taller and to an untrained eye will appear as if it's just grass that's not being mowed often enough. And then you will get complaints about appearance. So a mass of sedges is a good alternative to mowed turf grass, but it has to be a very short growing type of sedge. That said, there are all sorts of strategies you can use to reduce the amount of turf that you have in your established landscape. You can start off with a very ornamental looking edge species next to a sidewalk, and then back plant from there with any combination of native plants. You can take out, in addition of thinking of things to add to a landscape, you can also think in terms of what to subtract from a landscape. So if you have a large, say, square of turf grass, you can go into the middle and remove a large chunk of that grass from the middle and fill it with some native plant species that you could go ahead and establish something that would be a ground cover, like the pachyra, which was the groundsel, golden ragwort. You could do a ground cover first and then add some other layers, so a shrub layer and a tree layer, but starting with a ground cover that's not turf grass. The rose verbena is another flowering plant that likes to grow in a low mat. But think about those art elements when you look at the descriptions of the plants. So if you want to establish a ground cover, look for something that has a short height or something that has a spreading mat-like form. And then just based on the plant that matches those elements, you're going to be able to find species that will work. So something even like in the background of this photograph you see on your screen now, there is a mass of low-growing fragrant sumac. So a low-growing shrub could be an excellent alternative to mowed turf grass. And then in front of that shrub, there is some purple poppy mallow, which is another plant that you could use as a ground cover. So get creative. Think in terms of maybe starting with a border or subtracting some turf in the middle of a yard instead of just working from the edges in. But there's a lot of strategies. You'll have to just find one that works for your particular situation.
Great. Thank you for all those suggestions. So Lana has a long question here. How would you work around a rail fence that forms the edge between a wide planting bed and a walkway. Do you put taller plants next to the fence that would fit visually within that fence, or shorter plants to keep away from encroaching onto the walkway? Is this, she says for context, this is at the main entrance of a school building.
Okay, so yes, again, I would look at, so that particular location, what would work best for, it looks like you need to take the site programming into consideration here. So how the site is being used, if it's being used to access a building, a public building at that. Definitely don't want to plant anything close to the sidewalk that's going to impede people walking. So nothing that might flop over onto the sidewalk if you're not going to stay on top of the maintenance for those plants. So you might do a couple different species. You might do a low growing ground cover, or use a low growing grass as an edger next to the sidewalk, and then have something taller behind that. You could do something tall right adjacent to the fence, but you could also, keeping in mind that you're going to need to maintain the bed throughout the bed, you might want to try to consider maintenance needs before you select your plants, and either do just mulch or gravel right underneath that split rail fence and next to it, so that you keep access open behind the bed and next to the fence, or something low growing that you won't feel bad stepping on, like maybe something like a wild ginger or violets, something that you can tromp on when you need to, but you don't have to worry that you're killing or hurting your, beautiful beloved plants.
Thank you. Rebecca says that she had a purple coneflower bed along her property and the street. Last year, goldenrod showed up and bloomed in the fall. This year, there's twice as much. I think several of us have probably experienced that. And the purple coneflowers are less in that area. Would you let it grow or spread, or yank it, or any other combination of that?
This is probably just really going to rely on personal preference. If you like the goldenrod and you don't mind having more and more and more of it, let it go. If it really annoys you, then by all means, try to cut it back and suppress it. You will have to, an aggressive plant though, that is a prolific spreader, though, you are going to have to really, really keep on top of it in order to make progress in keeping it pushed back, or feel like you're, even just staying level with it, staying even with it. But yeah, I would say if it's not ideal, then definitely you're going to have to make a plan and make sure that you put in the time and the effort to keep it under control. But if you don't mind it, then, and there's no concern about it getting too tall and perhaps causing a safety issue with blocking sight lines from the street, then there's probably no big concern just letting it spread.
And it is, I think, and this may just be in central Illinois, is it the Canadian goldenrod that people are advising to maybe reduce and not plant? If I remember correctly, I don't know, someone in chat if you know if that's the case. So I think that tends to be the goldenrod that tends to just show up more than any other goldenrod. So Kimberly is asking, where would you start if you have a full acre you want to plant in natives for either pollinators or natural prairie?
Oh goodness, if I was doing a full acre all at one time, you're going to have to be patient, and you're going to have to allow yourself the luxury of time to do very good site preparation. Site preparation in large areas can take time. It can take 1 year, 2 years to really do adequate site preparation. But that's the most important thing for a successful long-term project at that scale. If you skimp on your site prep, you're going to regret it later, because you're going to be fighting weeds that you didn't have to fight, and you're not going to have as successful a response for the plants that you purchase and plant, either from container or from seed. You're not going to have the response and the success that you could have had if you just spent a little bit more time doing site prep. So importantly, for doing an acre at a time, you're going to want to kill off all the existing vegetation. For a site as large as an acre, the most efficient way to accomplish that is by use of an herbicide. Smaller sites, there are several strategies that you could use that are alternatives to using herbicide. If that makes you uncomfortable, that would be just as effective. But for a site as big as an acre, herbicide is really going to be the most efficient method of killing off the existing vegetation. And then it's just a matter of once your site has been prepped, I will say, if you are having issues with any invasive species, that's when you really may want to consider doing 2 full years of site prep, and during year 2, growing a cover crop, some sort of annual species that is not going to want to keep showing up and try to outcompete your natives that you plant in the future. So that is a really good strategy for helping to try to eradicate invasive species, is just have your site spend a year as a cover crop, a temporary species, instead of immediately going from killing existing vegetation to planting your permanent cover of your native species. But once you go into your planting, whether it's from seed or from containers, it'd be very expensive to do an entire acre from containers. If I were doing that, I would probably be planting species that are very aggressive and spread a lot, like the coreopsis and the goldenrods. I would probably be planting a lot of shrubs. So again, something that would spread, like a sumac, or some very large size trees. You know, you see where I'm going with this. Things that where you could plant fewer species that are going to spread on their own. But if you're doing an acre from seed, you really have a lot of flexibility to be creative with your species selection, depending on how you're going to use that acre, how you want that acre to look, and all those other considerations of the theme or the appearance of that planting in the future. So that's where your creativity comes into play, and that's going to help you select the species for your seed mix. But there's a lot of really excellent guides for the timing of when is the best time of year to do various site prep practices, when is the best time of year to sow seed, what might you consider using for after you've sown your seed, if you need to do any kind of mulching. If you're in a location with a lot of wind or heavy rain, you might need some mulch to help hold that seed in place until it germinates. So I would just say, if you're starting off on a project like that, and I'm sure Wild Ones has some excellent resources, but to follow one of those step-by-step guides so that you understand the timeline for your project and when each step needs to be conducted to be the most successful.
Great. And definitely good luck to you, Kimberly, on that huge project. And yeah, it's definitely needed to convert large spaces into natural areas. And that was our last question. So I just want to say thank you again, Rhonda. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.